Okay, so let's kickstart with the welcome. I just got the green light from the team. Day 2 of the Foundation Study of Cycles Science Summit 2022. Welcome from the Foundation of the Study of Cycles. And I'd like to also share that welcome with my team colleague, Ray Terms, with us right now. Ray, how did you find day 1 so far?
Yeah, it's interesting to get those perspectives on the historical process, wars and things. That was one of the early things I read was Raymond Wheeler's stuff and Krzyzewski. There's a lot of stuff that's accredited to Krzyzewski and to Wheeler, and I'm never sure who did the original research because it seems to be the same. It might have been Krzyzewski and Wheeler got hold of it.
Yes, I mean, there seems to be overlap across various pioneers in the industry, and it'll be good to see more awareness of all of the work. I'll briefly touch on Krzyzewski in terms of his some of his work, and hope that can maybe help create more interest.
Yeah.
Okay, so as we officially start, I'll follow up with the big welcome to all our attendees and new members that came on board with this current Foundation Study of Cycles Science Summit of 2022. Once again, a big celebratory note that we have a record attendance. So I literally had a conversation with our team just to find out what that trend looked like and how much of a new high is it. It's a great thing to celebrate right now in terms of the engagement and the interest in cycles. Our preview for our day 2 grand finale is head of the science and nature focus of the Foundation Study of Cycles, Ray Tomes. He'll be talking about the 207-year solar cycle. Myself, giving a brief highlight on natural cycles and financial markets, which is more of my specialization. And then at the very end, a fireside chat with our chairman, Dr. Richard Smith. We'll be discussing a range of different exciting initiatives in the year ahead for the foundation. But the starting point will naturally be the key insights from our 2-day summit, the importance of cycles in science and nature, and just on the point that Ray and I were discussing, this disruptive environment that we're in, what does it all mean, and how can cycles help us move forward? So there are some of the key touch points along with follow-up initiatives that we are looking forward to share with you. So a few touch points on membership benefits. We always like to add value to our existing members and invite more to join the team, the family of cycle researchers and just like-minded professionals. So one of the big questions is, what more can we share back with you? And the first point is regular webinars conducted by members of the cycle community. That is primarily featured in our active schedule of events. But as you'll notice over time, that is increasing alongside the YouTube multimedia offering, which will also feature additional resources. I'm excited to say that on that point, Ray will be reviving a series on science and nature in the second half of this year, and I'll be happy to support with that endeavor. So all of you who are interested in both markets and the science nature focus, please check out our YouTube channel for more educational content. And of course, we have a growing community of professionals, and we're always trying to engage and shape more communication and just further development of the work. And then lastly, keep in mind that the research must continue, and always encouraging scholars, scientists, non-professional investigators who are passionate about cycles analysis and how cycles can be used for the betterment of mankind. And just as a final point on that, for those who are looking for tangible ways to measure cycles, specifically in markets, and see them in action, of course, our cycle app is very unique and innovative, and available to those of you who are members. It's a tool that can decode cycles, apply cyclical analysis to detect dominant cycles in any data set. Back to the gratitude to our members, and the reminder that your help to fund all the events and materials we're planning to release this year is still very much key. Now, there are many ways that you can support us. One way, of course, is donation. So that's direct monetary support as a non-profit organization. But also there are other variations in terms of continued support towards raising awareness. So just continue doing the work that you do and raising awareness for cycles. We can all be stronger together with that shared vision. And then, of course, contribution of ideas, time, and community. We're always keen to welcome further ground, bottom-up support, so that we can broaden this work both globally, but also across the different focus areas that are of interest. And so, just contributing your ideas, time, and community is a big support to us. So we encourage you to do that. Remember that our website, cycles.org, will continue to update with further news or additional initiatives that we'll be releasing throughout the year. Okay, now in terms of the session ahead, before we introduce our first speaker, I just want to do some housekeeping in terms of questions and answers and how to basically facilitate them. So as per usual, we will take questions at the end. Please consider what questions you have in mind throughout the session, especially in the last 10 to 15 minutes, so that I can note them down and make sure that we can have an engaging and interactive Q&A. And as you do, please recall to put those questions in the Q&A box. We can note either the Q&A box or the Zoom chat, but the Q&A box just makes it that much easier to centralize and streamline. So with that, I will give a practice question for everyone. Always good to kind of engage at the start and get the ball rolling. And the follow-up question for day 2, given that many of you would have attended our first session, what are your key insights from our FSC Science Summit so far? So I was just asking Ray that question at the beginning, and we were talking about the various war cycles and what it all means in terms of the crisis patterns and the implications. With that point and maybe additional areas that were covered, what were the key insights that all of you have taken away from day 1, and just in general from the work that you have attended so far? So I'll let everyone think about that, and maybe we can get one person to share first, lead that example so that others can follow too. Okay, and now the official start and introduction. Ray Terms, our head of the Foundation Study of Cycles, Science and Nature, presenting on the 207-year solar cycle. While working in systems, software development, and economic modeling for prediction, Ray Terms discovered the importance of cycles. After joining the FSC in the 1980s, he spoke at numerous FSC conferences and ran a unit trust operating in futures. While studying cycles full-time, he developed harmonics theory to explain observed patterns of cycles and the entire structure of the universe. He founded Cycles Research Institute, developed by CATS, cycle analysis software, and speaks internationally. He joined the FSC board some time ago as science director. Terms is based in New Zealand, and I believe it is morning his time, evening for others in other parts of the world. Ray, welcome, welcome, welcome. And I'm really excited to listen to your presentation on the 207-year solar cycle.
Thank you, Ron. It's good to be here.
Great.
It's been since I did this work a year or so ago on this, seeing what was going to happen on this 207-year cycle. There's been a lot of news about solar storms that are almost going to hit the Earth, and I keep thinking, no, I wanted to make the prediction before it happened. I didn't want one happening after that. Before I give the talk, but I don't really want it happening after the talk either. It's only a 25% chance, but it's one thing that keeps you on your toes. Yeah.
G'day, I'm Ray Tone from New Zealand, and I'm the Science Director for the Foundation for the Study of Cycles. Today I want to talk to you about the 207-year solar cycle and its dramatic effects that it may have on the Earth. We have long-term historical records of what solar cycles are from proxies. There's two that are commonly used, carbon-14 and beryllium-10. What happens is tree rings from trees from all ages back as far as 10,000 years and more are analysed, and the amount of carbon-14, for example, is found. We can get the records of carbon-14 over long periods. We only have solar observations for about the last 400 years, 500 years, 400 years really. There are longer term ones, but not with telescopes because they hadn't been invented. So how does carbon-14 relate? Well, carbon-14 is made in the upper atmosphere when cosmic rays hit the nitrogen atoms in the atmosphere. Nitrogen is atomic weight 14, and by hitting it, it can turn it into a carbon-14. Now, this is a highly energetic event from cosmic rays, and the cosmic rays are modulated by the sun and the solar wind. So it's a measure of the solar activity. This is generally accepted as the best estimates we have for solar activity over the long term. These measurements show, I did analysis of two series. One was of carbon-14 measurements and one of beryllium-10 measurements. They were done at 5 and 10 year intervals for periods of about 8,000 to 10,000 years. And they show, when we do a cycles analysis on them, a number of periods are found, and one of the strong ones is 207.7 years in one of those series and 206.86 years in the other one. So we can say 207 is a fairly good measure. This cycle is called the Suisse or de Vries cycle, and it's accepted as being a real solar cycle. We don't know the cause of it and what happens. I'll give some suggestion of a possible relationship to it of other cycles later. Some of the other cycles that are found, one of about 352 years, one of about 104 years, which is around half a 207-year one. This thing of having cycles exactly half of others is quite common. Also 86 years, and a cluster of cycles around 55 to 60 years, which means that cycle is strongly modulated. Now, these cycles show up in climate also. Raymond Wheeler, in his studies of climate, mentions a number of these. He mentions a 200-year cycle, a 500-year cycle, a 355-year cycle, and these tie in with these things. More recently, studies, the individual tree rings have had their carbon-14 analysed so that we get yearly intervals between the measurements rather than 5 or 10 years, and some new discoveries were made based on that. The interesting thing is, one study reports that they find 3 years, 660 BC, 775 AD, and 994 AD, where there was a discontinuity in the carbon-14. It was travelling along, and suddenly it did a jump in a short period. So something very dramatic happened on the sun at that time, at those times, I should say. Now, it so happens that those intervals between those are very close to 207-year multiples. So it seems to be connected to the 207-year cycle. There have been some other ones found since then. They don't all conform to that, so this is only part of the story. Here's a graph of the period around 775 AD, where measurements from tree rings in 7 different countries are shown. One of the countries in New Zealand, where I live, which is in the southern hemisphere, all the others are in the northern hemisphere, and you can see that there's a sudden discontinuity at 775 AD. They all take a giant leap upwards. Now, if we extend those dates forward, assuming a 207-year cycle, we discover that the next time that such a thing might happen would be around 2025 AD, plus or minus 6 years. In other words, coming soon. Now, it's clear that not every cycle does something like this happen, but I estimate there's approximately a 25% chance of having this sort of event when the 207-year cycle comes around. I'd suggest a working hypothesis is that the sun warms up for half the cycle. As it goes through the peak and starting to dive, there's a blowout from the sun, dramatic events, mass ejected from the sun that flies out through the solar system. Now, it's the luck of the draw whether the Earth happens to be in the line of that wherever it goes each time. So that's why it's maybe 25%. This is a graph of the carbon-14. This data was provided to me by Christopher J. Eastoe of Arizona, and he includes several series which I've joined together, and I've omitted the early part where there was some missing data. So I'm showing from just before 1000 AD up to 1950. We don't have data, good data on carbon-14 beyond 1950, because in the 1950s, a number of countries began to do atomic bomb tests in the atmosphere, and they severely disrupted the carbon-14 levels. So we have to look at other ways to measure past there. But we can see enough from these other things to see what's going on. So this first graph is showing that period, and you can see that clearly see the 207-year cycle, the shorter ups and downs there. But you can also see that there's a high in the 12th century, a low in the 1500s and around 1700, and then coming back to a high again at 1950. Now that hasn't reached the high there. That cycle has got another at least 50 years to go to reach the high of that of the 207-year cycle. So there's also longer cycles. There's a 2,300-year cycle, which is generally accepted, and a possible 6,600-year cycle. The 2,300-year cycle is not due to peak for some time yet. This is the same graph with some labels. The red A's are the peaks of the 207-year cycle. You can see they're happening fairly regularly there, but over that interval they're only about 200 years apart, whereas the average is 207. You can see 3 X's there also, which show peaks at around 1150, around 1500, and around 1850. Those intervals of 355 years is one cycle that Wheeler mentions in climate. So these are both solar cycles and climate cycles, in my opinion. There's one additional peak there at about 1250 AD, which doesn't fit with either of those two cycles. This may be some other cycle or something else, but it won't be random. The things that are happening here are all having proper causes, I believe. Edward R. Dewey reported common harmonically related cycles periods in his 1967 landmark paper, The Case for Cycles. I highly recommend this paper for anyone who's interested in cycles. It's unfortunate that in the intervening decades, not enough attention has been paid to this. He took some very good advice from Feynman and followed that advice about when is a cycle real, when is it not, when should you look for the causes within the system or from outside. And the conclusion he had was that was quite radical at the time was that a lot of the cycles came from outside the Earth. And we now know that the space weather is a very important thing, but at those times it hadn't been heard of. And in fact, when one man studied those, and he just tried to say that the thing they called the solar constant was not constant, he was ridiculed, but we now know that he was right. So in Dewey's paper, he talks about common cycles that are related by simple whole number ratios, mostly 2s and 3s and multiples and powers of those. We found that this in the solar cycle, in fact, that 207-year cycle, there's also a 104-year cycle, very close to half of that, so it would be surprising if it wasn't in fact that. And this occurs in many other things, ranging from cycles in days or even hours and minutes, right up to geological cycles in the hundreds of millions of years. We find these ratios happening. A number of people have tried to say that these may be chaos theory, which will produce frequency doubling, but in fact it's not. I've produced a thing called the harmonics theory, and it explains exactly all the cycles that are observed, all the common cycles from 600 million years down to a couple of weeks are predicted by the harmonics theory based on a single axiom, a very simple axiom, and the date, the length of the longest cycle. In those common cycles, there's no mention of a 207-year cycle or anything closely related to it. However, Dewey finds a 71-year cycle, and we may note that the 355-year cycle is exactly 5 times that. So there's possibly a relationship there. The reason for the 207-year cycle is not known. There's no known mechanism. However, when we study the cycles in the vicinity of 11 years, the common cycles, taking the data from about 1700 through to the present, we find that that divides. When we look at it accurately, we find that there are in fact 4 cycles periods around that vicinity, one of 10.0 years, one of 11.0, one about 11.9, and one of 10.5 years. Now these periods relate to a number of known planetary cycles, which different theories have been made for how this would affect the Sun. For example, 9.93 years is very close to the 10-year one, and that is the period of conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn. Conjunctions are important because when 2 planets conjunct with the Sun, their tidal forces are at a maximum, and tidal forces is one of the mechanisms that we expect here. 11.05 years is the Jupiter-Venus-Earth common conjunctions, good conjunctions. Interestingly, that one, the conjunctions occur sometimes at 10.38 years and sometimes at 12.00. And when a study is done of the average periods, the periods of the sunspot cycle, it's found it's bimodal distribution with peaks around 10.4 and 12.0 years. So it looks like that's on the mark. 11.86 years is the period of Jupiter around the Sun. Now Jupiter's orbit is somewhat elliptical, and it's the biggest, most massive planet that has a big effect on the tides of the Sun. So that's also expected to be found. Now the only one that's not found like that is one of 10.5 years, perhaps just a smidgen under 10.5 years. My suspicion is that that is the actual natural oscillation period of the Sun in terms of making sunspots, and that these other ones being close to it also can drive it. When we analyse those individual ones, we find some very strong cycles there that persist throughout the entire period, that the number of sunspots at the peak of each of those cycles is several times higher than the low, and the whole lot interact. Now, it so happens that taking the 10.5 years with the 10 and 11-year cycles, you get beats, and the beats that you get are quite close to 207 years. It depends exactly what those periods are. and what the 10.5 is, but it does look like this is a possible mechanism for explaining the 207-year cycle. There's a debate about the relationship between solar activity and climate, and it seems that the various cooler periods are associated with the lower solar activity, especially relating to the 207-year cycle. The cluster of cycles around 55 to 60 years period are also clearly evident in global temperatures and circulation patterns on Earth. It would be surprising if this were not the case, as essentially all the Earth's energy comes from the sun. That being said, it is also clear that the solar activity shown in the above graphs has a long-term fall and a rise over the last millennium. This is showing the 2300-year cycle that is found in the longer periods. So what I'm saying is there's going to be a peak in the 207-year cycle. We may be slightly past it, but we're at the point where the sun has the blowout of a lot of energy, which may or may not hit the Earth. But although the 207-year cycle will be heading down for the next century, the 2,300-year cycle is still going up. So as we saw in the graph of the reversed carbon-14, from 1700 to 1800 there was a big rise in that graph. Then a smaller fall to 1900, and then a big rise to 1950, which we believe has continued to 2000. And solar activity. So if we come to this climate debate, there's some good data about this that indicates that the IPCC has got the wrong idea. It's not human-caused CO2 that is causing climate change. There are a number of bits of evidence for this. One of them is that when we look at it over the ice ages, the last tens of thousands of years and more, it found that that rather than carbon dioxide preceding changes in temperature, it lags it. In other words, the temperature change occurs first, then the carbon dioxide change. I decided to do an analysis of this 10 years or so ago using data collected with carbon dioxide, which is monthly data is available for more than 50 years, and we've got global temperatures over that period monthly also, and so I analysed those together. And here's a graph showing what they look like, and you can see that, and I've done a smoothing operation. I've taken the average change. I'm looking at changes because changes show shorter term cycles better, and shorter-term fluctuations and causes much better than the graphs themselves. So the changes that happen in a year, and I've taken an average over a 12-month period to get the to remove the seasonal effects and show clearly the what's actually happening. And when we do that, we can actually see in the graph that there's a lag between the temperature change and the carbon dioxide change, which happens later. It's possible to do a lagged correlation on that, and this graph shows that, and it shows quite clearly that the temperature change precedes the CO2 change by about 6 months, dropping off on either side there. If we look the other way around, if we're looking for CO2 change to precede temperature change, there are no big correlations at all there. The biggest one is 0.15, whereas the other one is 0.42. So it's quite clearly that the cause is running in the other direction. How could that be so? Isn't carbon dioxide a greenhouse gas? Well, there's a lot of stuff about that, and a lot of it's not right. Some of the experiments that people have done, they've actually fiddled the data that they've shown in their videos, not mentioning Al Gore by name particularly. But anyway, so how can it be this way? How can temperature cause a change in CO2? Well, it's a well-known chemistry fact, which some of us learned in school, that if you dissolve gases in water and then you heat the water up, the gases come out of the water, and carbon dioxide does just that. So if the temperature is going up because the sun is warming the earth, then we will expect carbon dioxide to come out of the sea and to put more of it into the atmosphere. Now, that the 6-month period is a reasonable one for that to happen for the surface layers of the sea. Over the seasons, there's a mixing of the upper layers of the sea with the atmosphere, and it's getting warmed. The upper layers are the ones that warm the most, so we can expect some of those to be releasing carbon dioxide in this manner. The longer term one, the 800-year lag in the Ice Age periods, is understood by a bigger mechanism. The deeper oceans will mix with the surface oceans over that sort of period of time. So we would expect that again. So the known chemistry, the known physics, the known activity of the oceans all fit with the explanation that it's a temperature change that causes the carbon dioxide change on two different timescales. Now, but hasn't human activity increased and caused this carbon dioxide? Well, it has, and humans have released carbon dioxide, but there's some other evidence about the activity of creatures. Studies have been done on insects and find that when it's warmer, they run around a lot more. Same thing is true of various animals. Same thing is true of humans, and of many animals. Many animals hibernate during the winter, so we know that when it's colder, animals are less active, and when it's warmer, they're more active. And in fact, if we look at the past couple of thousand years, we know that at the times that the Earth was warmer, there were great civilizations rose to their maximum, and when it got colder, they died off again. And we can see that with lots of the civilizations around the world. So what I'm suggesting is that the warming by the sun that causes the CO2 to be released, but that's not the reason for the effect, also causes more activity amongst humans. And particularly the rise in the last century, where humans have gone crazy with all sorts of things, making all sorts of things, some of them good, some of them not so good. But that's the result of the sun acting on humans, reacting on the environment, the temperatures, and humans responding to that in various ways. I don't think anyone else has really looked at it this way. I'm surprised because the effects on animals and insects and other things are well known, even the bit about the civilizations, but no one seems to have said the change is caused by the sun affecting human activity, and that's not causing the carbon dioxide. It's a parallel thing caused by the rise in temperature. So what conclusions can we draw from all of this? The 207-year cycle in solar activity has associated dramatic expulsions of energy, and we are within a few years of that part of the cycle. These ejection events have about a 25% chance of hitting the Earth. If that happens, we can expect massive disruptions to the power and electronic systems that have become a part of our daily lives. It's not going to wipe out life on Earth, it's not going to wipe out humans, it's not going to be the end of civilization, but it's going to be a bit of a pause on it and some serious problems if that hits the Earth, these coronal mass ejections. There's every possibility that it will, maybe a 25% chance, and every possibility it won't. But either way, we can expect the temperatures on Earth to begin to decline over the next century. So I'll stack up that projection against the IPCC, and I don't believe humans will get carbon dioxide under control in the near term. So I think we'll see this reversal in temperatures happening irrespective of whether they get that under control or not, and we can look at what's going on there. The decline will not be as great as the rise because we're still rising on the 2300-year cycle, and that will still go on for some time yet. So we will see some decline in temperatures in the 21st century, and in the 22nd century we will expect to see another big rise in temperatures again. So we ought to get ready for that. The pause that we have now can be used to prepare for that. But it's not a disaster. Temperatures going up increases human activity. It increases crops and crop yields. Carbon dioxide going up improves crop yields also. These things are actually a boon to humans, and all the stuff about it, that it's going to destroy crops or do harm to humans, it's not true. When it's warmer, less people die from the cold, and not so many people die from warm as cold. Some do, of course, around the equator, that will increase, but in other places, the deaths from cold will decrease. I'll put up some notes now. These are the various studies that I've used in this report. Cycles and sunspot number reconstructions for 11,000 years. Analysis of BE10 records as a solar irradiance proxy. That first one was carbon-14. Relationships between solar activity and delta 14C, peaks in AD 775, AD 994, and 660 BC. The Case for Cycles by Edward Dewey. And does human-produced CO2 cause global temperature change? So that one's done by me. So that's those are things that I've used in here and which are relevant to this discussion. Okay, thank you all for your attention. Have a good time. And may we get missed by the solar mass ejection.
Great presentation, Ray. And if I can invite you to follow up with any additional comments as we build up the Q&A section.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. There's a couple of things I'd like to add that I've realised. I mentioned that there's a 355-year cycle in there, as well as the 207. The three ones in the paper that were published showed times when major C14 changes happened. But in terms of these big events happening on the sun, the only one that's happened in the last few hundred years was in 1859. It's called the Carrington event. And I realized looking at this thing that 1859 is smack in the bang in the middle of that last X where there's a peak in the C14. So that one did happen. It wasn't one of the 207-year cycles, but it is showing that both the 207 and the 355-year cycles can cause this sort of events. So that's important. There have been, since I first worked this stuff out a year or two ago, there's been a lot of extra reports of solar storms in the news. And I was a bit getting worried that it was going to beat me to the punch, but before I could put this information out there. But some of them missed the Earth and some of them went so big. It does seem as though around that time, it's not just one big blowout of the sun, it's going poof, 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 boom, you know, sort of thing. So whether we're getting a boom, I don't know. Someone else might be able to help me on this. I think the person who first started saying that the solar constant wasn't, his name was Abbott, and I think he had an association with the Foundation for the Study of Cycles, and he did measurements over a very long period in the early parts of last century through to the middle, and he was rubbished by a lot of scientists for that. And as cycles researchers, we experience this. We go into fields that we may not even be experts in, and we say things, and people say, you don't know what you're talking about, but it turns out that later on that we did. So that's one case with the space weather. Because Dewey was realizing that it came from beyond the Earth. I realized back in the 1970s and 80s that it came from beyond the Earth. Dewey had already realized that, but I didn't know about him at that stage. So these things, there's ample evidence of that. Now, how do I turn off that share again? Stop share, there it is. Okay, so those little additions to it. And so now we've got some questions, I believe. Question one. Have you tried to estimate excess carbon in the atmosphere given the temperature carbon cycle you mentioned? I haven't done that, no, but there's no doubt you could do a correlation between the carbon and the temperature or the C14 cycle. So that's a worthwhile suggestion for something to be done. Thanks, Jeffrey. It's always interesting to look at these things. And I realised
Ray,
that.
I was just going to say there's a follow-up question, but I'll pause.
Yeah, okay.
Please do.
I said the IPCC are going to be wrong, but the thing is, if I'm right, the amount of carbon dioxide, if the temperatures start to drop, the carbon and the CO2 in the atmosphere will start to drop as well. So it's not going to. They may think they've got it under control, but it may be nothing to do with them. What causes the 10-year cycle, 120 months? This is Calvert. The 10-year, it's not for certain, but it seems as though it's the 9.93-year cycle of Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions. Certainly, when we look at those, there's a strong correlation between the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions and the solar cycle. These three cycles that are in the range near 11 years, you can. They each have a very strong correlation with the sunspot cycle, so that at the point of the alignments, the number of sunspots is more than double at the trough, and that applies to all three of those things over the whole period, averaged out. Question 3: plants use more CO2 in summer to decrease CO2 in. Yeah, so CO2, we can talk more about CO2 in plants. We're told that rising CO2 is a disaster. It's not. Carbon dioxide is plant food. Plants need it to grow. And unless it gets up to about 10 times what it is now, it's not a problem for humans, the CO2. So if in market gardening, people with greenhouses pump CO2 in there to make their plants grow faster, and this works. So carbon dioxide is a boon, and rising temperatures are a boon. Plants grow faster when the temperatures are higher. So the things that are happening that they're calling a disaster, it's not a disaster at all. Now, was there a follow-up question, Ron?
Yes, I mean, the one actually that I wanted to ask builds on the confluence of the cycles that you've identified in terms of the time pattern, the question on 10-year cycles and sunspots, but then also an open question on other confluences that you found in other data series. We spoke about this briefly before on call. What can you share with us in terms of other confluence of timing patterns that line up with your work?
So specifically the 10-year cycle, you mean?
Well, 10-year cycle as a case in point.
Yeah. A lot of people talk about a 10-year cycle in the stock market. I haven't done a particular study on that, but when in one of the market seminars, someone talked about that, and I went and had a look at the data, and I found that then when I did the 9.93, it fitted it better than 10. So it's a 9.93 year cycle. You're not going to notice a difference from 10 unless you do quite a few cycles, but it does fit better. So when you do that, you can get the shape. You can get the shape of the 10-year cycle in the stock market. So there is agreement there. I think there are a couple other things. You need to look up Dewey's table of cycles because it's got all the different ones that have got common periods, you know. So there's various common periods you found. The 10-year isn't one of the major ones of those. The one around 9 years, 8.9 years is much more common one.
I know in terms of time patterns and confluence, you'll be looking to publish more on harmonics and how the importance of them to cycle work.
Yes. So as I get older and stupider, I'm just trying to do one more thing, which is to do the final version of the harmonics theory stuff. I've got lots of talks there, so you can find them on the internet. But I want to do a series of talks. We may have a harmonics seminar, and I'll do it as stages of different bits and pieces relating to that. Why did the idea come about? How many other people have had ideas related to that, or noticed the pattern? Dewey noticed the pattern. Several other people have noticed the pattern as well before me. But then I think I'm the one who worked out what causes the pattern. That's the important part.
Great, look forward to it. And I'm just going to check to see if there's any further questions. We have one from our chairman, Richard. Why do you think that scientists have failed to recognize this cycle correlation?
I think it's because knowledge is too compartmentalized. In the old days, you can have a Renaissance man who studied science and poetry and art. And I've been watching a series on Leonardo da Vinci. The guy did a lot of things, you know. He had to solve architecture problems. He had to solve forces problems, getting a thing up on the roof of a cathedral. And he did art and he did science and he studied the human body and everything. These days, people get in one little narrow field and they put the blinkers on and they go down there. And if somebody from outside their field starts to tell them something, they get very wild. You didn't study this, but you don't have to study that. You just got to see some data and see the relationship to other things. So I think that's a serious problem in our education system. And I want to suggest that all the people that made great advances in science didn't do that. They looked at it a wider field and they often made connections outside the thing. And all of them were ridiculed by the establishment when they did it. In quantum mechanics, the ones that did the new discoveries, they said, we've discovered we can't convince the old people. There's only one way of changing what people think. Start teaching the young ones and wait for the old ones to die off.
We just had one member say lateral thinkers, building on the insights that were shared with our first speaker on day one.
That's right, lateral versus linear thinkers. Absolutely, yeah. Yeah. I love that point. It's a very good point. Well said.
And if I can also raise the point, your inspiration to develop a scholarship program of some sort to actually inspire more people to research in cycles.
That's right. I want to offer. I've got a charitable trust, and it's offering scholarships to people for either published work or for doing research relating particularly, especially to harmonics and cycles, but in cycles in general, but the harmonics is the important thing to us understand that. It's not that scientists haven't done cycles work. I can find lots of cases where scientists have done work in cycles, but it's been in their particular field and they haven't recognized that it's connecting somewhere else. So I think that's the important thing to answer Richard's question, and that we can, we need to get, at one time in the past, there were a number of established scientists in the foundation. And then we had a few problems where a lot of it died out. And so we're re-establishing that. The market side of the foundation is well established again. What we now need to do is get well established on the science side as well in nature. And I think we are heading towards that. I hope to see it happen.
Absolutely. With a follow-up of this event that we're holding now and future ones to come, and the series that we'll be hosting soon. We also have a question from Martin H. Back onto the point of, I believe, the climate story. Is it not possible to definitively determine whether global warming is due to direct solar gain rather than greater retention of heat due to greenhouse effect alone? And then he has a final point, and isn't the concern about warming that we'll have 100 meters of sea level rise?
Yeah, I think that would, if that was going to happen, I think that would be a genuine problem. We've had an enormous amount of sea level rise already. Around the world, there are loads of places that have been found that are 50 and 70 meters below sea level, where there's cities, right? Big cities. These ones date back to before the end of the last ice age, about 11,000 years ago. So the world has had this happen. We have stories like the biblical flood and so on. I suspect that that's probably telling us that sea levels rose, and they had to get things going again. There's a number of different possible explanations for that, but it does seem that there's knowledge of that this sort of stuff did happen. And the Aborigines in Australia have passed it down through the generations that at one stage they walked to Australia, right, originally, and they've been passing this information down about the rise in sea levels. So it's happened. I don't think it will go a lot higher, but it may go a bit higher. It is going up at the moment.
And then we have, well, I believe a comment and potential question from PRC. I think one of the greatest reasons is that with Ray's conclusion, the sun being the cause of warming versus IPCC saying it's CO2 results and the different degree of doing something about it. With the sun being the cause, humans cannot do anything about it. But with CO2, humans can do something about it. So saying CO2 causing warming is something that can be used as a control measure of human action, both from on nations, corporations, humans. Anyhow, great work done, Ray.
Thank you. Yeah. If CO2 was the cause, why did global temperatures drop from 1940 to 1970? Because CO2 was still going up. And my answer is that the cycles around 60 years in the sun did their thing. If you look back over the temperatures, you find that there was a rise from 1910 to 1940, a fall to 1970, and a rise up to 2000 again, and it's been fairly steady since then. And that's the 60-year cycle. I've done some more work on that, but I haven't put that in here. There's a 53-year component and a 59-year component in that. The 53-year component is the Kondratiev cycle, the well-known Kondratiev cycle, and that can be traced back a long time. The 59-year cycle is a further set of conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn. Jupiter and Saturn, 2 orbits of Saturn and 5 of Jupiter, bring them back to the same part of the sky. And that 59-year cycle, the Chinese have their 60-year one and 12s and 30s, which is approximations of those 2 planets. That is important.
We have a compound of positive support and open invitation, Ray, for an education course and mentoring program. With any extra time that you might have, what would you like to share with those that are interested?
Oh, yeah, well, I'm happy to do any program like that. We'll need other people to contribute as well. I've got a lot of stuff that's already on the internet. We're going to try and reorganize some of that to make it more accessible because it's all scattered around the place. So I'll try and make a big index to it. Ron and I have talked about making a cyclopedia. One of the things is to try and get Wikipedia, get more cycle stuff in there. There is a list of cycles in there that's very well organized. I set the thing up, and a lot of people have done a lot more work since that tells you all the different places you can find stuff about cycles in Wikipedia. We need to redo the foundation and Dewey because they've been merged into one article, and they're obviously 2 different things. We want to get that set up, but we suspect that if we try to do all the things, I've got experience in this of trying to put stuff in Wikipedia and having people come and delete it, and it's a battle. So we thought we'll make our own. We'll call it Cyclopedia, and put all the stuff, all the knowledge of cycles that we've got into there, all properly indexed and cross-linking and all of that, because it's the cross-linking that's important. And when we just do a talk about one thing, we don't do that. So if we get it really well established like that, then Wikipedia are welcome to pinch as much of it as they want, and we'll get it there available to everyone.
Great. It's the presentation and the Q&A section that followed has perked a lot of interest. No doubt we'll be getting further questions in the second part of the session, and we'll send it through to you, Ray, to follow up if possible.
Thanks very much, Ron.
Welcome. Your insights have also helped kind of build up some of the scientific detail, which I need to lean more onto you for in the presentation that I've prepared, which is more about natural cycles in markets. That'll be useful.
Okay.
Just 1 second, I'll share the screen.
Am I supposed to introduce you now, Ron?
If you wish.
Okay. So Ron has had an interest in natural cycles and markets for a long period of time. Before you can read what's up there as well as I can, and he's obviously got a lot of experience in these areas. I've found Ron, he's taken over a role. We had a fellow, Mark, who was doing a lot of this work. Unfortunately, he died. It was a big loss to the foundation. Ron has taken up a lot of that work with enthusiasm, and he's helped me to move forward on some of these things where otherwise I would have been not so doing so well. So I'm very pleased to introduce Ron and have him talk about roadmap. That word roadmap occurs in the book about Wheeler. You know that, don't you?
Yes, I also remember having the privilege, like many others, of opening the book and leaning the big cover over my shoulder out in New York. I look forward to it being digitized so that many more people around the world can study it.
So while we're on that subject, before you go on, I think we can get access to Wheeler's big book. At one stage, the foundation had it, but when we had some problems, it was given away and it's gone somewhere else, and we can't get it back. But at the very least, what we really want is the information in it, which means if somebody who's nearer to it than what I am can go in there with a camera and take photos of all the pages, we can stick that up on the internet for people to look at, because it is a fantastic thing. It's a huge book. They're not kidding when they call it the big book. Okay, Ron, please share with us natural cycles and markets.
Thank you very much. So really excited to be sharing a few insights from a market perspective, which later on progressed into natural cycles, and many late nights researching the subject and meeting with like-minded professionals. It's definitely been enlightening being part of the Foundation Study of Cycles leadership team, and specifically having kind of regular talks with Ray and engaging in his encyclopedic knowledge of cycles in general, but specifically cycles in science and nature. And so I was really keen in helping to prepare this summit along with the team effort to raise further awareness where possible from different angles. So this is the focus on natural cycles and markets. Now, the key topics are starting with our founder, Edward Dewey, the foundation of the study of cycles in terms of its backstory from cycle prediction being born out of the 1930s Great Depression, and this idea that each of the disruptive regimes tend to create a crisis opportunity of sorts, particularly in terms of innovative thinking and best practices for the next time that pattern repeats. That kind of builds into some of the work that I did on the market side and continue to as part of a signature cycle framework. This is a market focus used by my mentor, Robin Griffiths, a gentleman with 50 years experience in markets, but always an open mind and curious thought process in terms of the cause effect of market dynamics, and very much some of the new information that we still need to learn about how these things play out. The specific focus there is the decennial cycle, which is a whole presentation in itself. But the key thing there is the not just that pattern itself, but how that pattern is found elsewhere, and the trigger for venturing more into natural drivers behind different cyclical patterns, and specifically the decennial one. And then, of course, the follow-up, the case for cycles, as Dewey wrote, but I've added the extra word, the case for natural cycles, not to suggest that there's a correlation across the board, but to at least open our mind to the importance of cycles in both science and nature, relating to what I will show to you today. There's useful frameworks for describing this, and I think this is usually the most challenging thing for first-time cycle enthusiasts when learning about the subject. There's so much data to analyze, but also new mental maps that are required to actually absorb the information, understand it, and put it to use. I continue to learn, but also to find different modalities that can help with the learning. So I'll share with you a scientific, a natural or planetary cycle feedback model that helps give a little bit of that framework, which will then take us into sunspot cycles. A brief word on that. Ray is the go-to person for the scientific detail and research. So save those questions for Ray. But I'm happy to talk about the testing that I've done in terms of sunspot cycles and the impact with markets, and then also external cycles that may potentially influence the sun. And then finally, a composite cycle index, which includes some of the work that I'm highlighting here and what it suggests for the future ahead. Okay, so in terms of Dewey, the foundation and the modern cycle prediction born out of the 1930s, there's the big crash, post-Wall Street boom and bust. Dewey first became interested in cycles while chief economic analyst of the Department of Commerce in 1930 or 31, because President Hoover at the time wanted to know the cause of the Great Depression. And so this really sets this a backstory for each crisis event throughout history, which leads to a need to understand why certain things happen, and more specifically, if we knew why, what could we do? And so Dewey's certainly at the heart of that story back then. It led to the foundation being born in the early 1940s. We're an 80-year-old wise society. And of course, you know, a lot of research that then followed as a lifetime endeavor for both Dewey, the original founders, and then many like-minded professionals that followed. Now, the learning journey for many tends to be founded in historical patterns of the past. That was certainly true for myself in terms of ancient history, and specifically in Egypt, where my cultural heritage is from, and actually where I'm speaking to you all live right now, geographically. That influenced my journey to study historical patterns. I mean, in terms of the intelligence of ancient cultures, the way that they analyzed information, and then fast forward 20 years ago, how to apply that to markets, which is continued more of the specialization. Now, the starting point for me with Dewey's research was very much rooted in curiosity. And originally at the time, my mentor who gave me some of the Cycles magazines from years ago, it was an archive collection that he had, and he just gave it to me as a young, bright-eyed junior analyst. He said, read this, enlightenment to realize knowledge, and just learn. And then later, through my association with the Technical Analysis Society, IFTA, as part of their body of knowledge, Dewey's book was part of the recommended reading. And as you just mentioned, as you just heard there from our FSC head of science and nature, the Foundation Study of Libraries originally hosted, the work of other cycle enthusiasts like Raymond Wheeler, and also much of Dewey's work. So while in the US visiting the library, I did manage to read briefly some of that work in person back when that was possible. So a great journey, which I continue to continue. I'm looking forward to continue in terms of Dewey's research and the FSC resources that we will develop. Now, what's great to highlight is that just speaking with my FSC hat on, we do have an education initiative project in progress. It will likely form in the second half of this year, so that we can actually have a professional recognition for the study of cycles. And so many newcomers to the industry, or even existing seniors, can have a more formalized and specialized way of learning about the subject. And as wearing two hats, both on behalf of the Foundation Study of Cycles and IFTA, the International Federation of Technical Analysis, we hope to form alliances with other influential cycles and market analysis groups in order to be stronger together and raise further awareness, particularly on the education side. And you heard Ray there talk about potential scholarships and various other education initiatives that can help with that work. Now, back on point to the presentation at hand, and now the signature cycle framework in markets that I followed for years, originally adopted from my mentor, Robin Griffiths, with a specific focus on the decennial cycle and how that triggered my interest into natural cycles and specifically sunspots. So the top-down framework is visualized as this three-part circle. It's a blended approach using macro fundamental, driven by behavioral technical analysis, big highlight on the word behavioral, and a blend of quantitative and qualitative filters. The yellow circle at the bottom right is the focus on cycles as part of a roadmap model, which includes economic business cycles, seasonal patterns, and much more. And then just finally, on the left in green, trend ranking models, just to be able to run a selection process on best and worst trends, global markets, multi-asset sectors and stocks, and various other proxies that can help identify opportunities. Now, the cycle framework is based on an adapted cycle schema based on the work of Joseph Schumpeter. This is what was originally adopted by my mentor, Robin Griffiths. And Schumpeter is documented to have studied the work of other cycle pioneers and develop a cycle schema, which originally, I believe, include the Kondratiev wave, the jugular wave, the kitchen wave, which later on became known as the business cycle or the presidential cycle. And I believe there was a fourth cycle, which averaged out 20 years. Ray and I were talking about this some time ago, and I believe that could be true. And then finally, the additional cycle that we added to the mix is the seasonal cycle at the bottom. Just think about the annual patterns to market performance right here and now. Some may go away, but also at the start of the year, as the year starts, so it ends, and the infamous autumn fall crash cycle, which tends to be the most robust pattern. Now, I can say a little bit about each cycles, but I just want to keep it focused on the decennial cycle and the connection with sunspots. But just quickly, the Kondratiev wave cycle is highly influential on interest rates. And as you heard on day one, also commodities and wars or social unrest. The jugular cycle is ultimately what is similar to the 10-year pattern and as you'll see soon, sunspots. And the business cycle, I think there are variations of that, so it depends how you look at it, but essentially the presidential element is what's key this year with the US midterms ahead and how that might influence in terms of policy, spending, and just general redirection in order to be voted again for the next season. Now, if you check the Foundation Study of Cycles website and look at our evidence of cycles page, you will find this screenshot, which actually gives you cycle research in action. You can see the header there at the top, decennial cycles across 100 years of stock market history. I already have this data at hand and look at it on a regular basis, but I thought it'd be good to show everyone what's already available on the Foundation website. What it shows, other than the decennial over 100 years, is the key outlier information. And if you look at year number, these are all years of a decade, so 0, 1, 2, 3, all the way to 9. But the 5th year of every decade, on average, is the best performing year in looking at US equity market history. And that is one of the key elements of the decennial pattern in terms of stock market performance. The other thing is that the start and the end of the decade tend to be negatively skewed. And you can see it in year 0 and 1. You can't really see it in 8 and 9, but of course you can see the drop off in performance that does happen. And particularly year 7, I think this is also documented based on the work of W.D. Gann, where they're seen as a crisis pattern that exists during that time too. Key message, 5th year of the decade tends to be the best performer. and the start and end tend to be negatively skewed. What's interesting is if you dig into the data and look how each of the years of each of the 50 years of a decade, over 100 plus years, if not more, how the 50-year outlier best performer year performed, you'll see that actually it's not a one-size-fits-all outcome. So you can see there the average is positive. If you look at the 10-year average of the last 100 years of the fifth year, I know that's a very long-winded way of describing this, but hopefully it's clear and everyone is can see the visuals to enhance that point. So that's what we see here. If I go back, this big blue bar is basically the rising blue line in the midsection of this data set. But always important to not just look at consensus data, but also outliers in the data, just to get a true understanding of the behavior of that market cycle pattern, and maybe also then ask the question why, what was the exception? And you can see here the outliers were in 1915, where that was an amplified best performing fifth year of the decade of the 1900s. But the worst performing fifth year of the decade was in 2015. And it was in 2015 that I had a late night restless sleep in trying to work out why one of our team's market calls when working for an institutional hedge fund did not work. We had to have really challenging conversations with clients who wanted to know what went wrong and why all of this useful analysis just didn't come true in that point in time. Now, there are lots of technical market macro analysis and technical framework that explained what happened right there and then. But my thinking was more on the cyclical side in terms of the potential cause and effect and other drivers that might be at play. So a quick highlight on notable research on the decennial pattern. There is a vast amount of research out there. I'm only going to highlight a little bit. So the first one I think that is worth highlighting is Edgar Lawrence Smith. And this is going back to the early 1900s. Of course, if you want to go back another century, 1800s, and even further back, you'll find more. So a lot of this is ongoing research across many centuries. But if we just go back to early 1900s, the work of Edgar Lawrence Smith in his book, Tides and Affairs of Men, presented the notion of a 10-year stock pattern. And here's the key point for some of you Dewey enthusiasts and the cycle work that he did on the 40-month cycle. Smith's theory resulted from combining two other theories, Wesley's Mitchell 40-year cycle theory and the theory of seasonality. Combining these two periods, Smith theorized that there must be a 10-year or 120-month cycle. This would result from 10 12-month annual cycles and 3 40-month cycles coinciding every 10 years. If you can get your head around that pattern, that's why there are variations of what seems to be a fixed pattern on face value, but often there can be exceptions. He also hypothesized that occasionally a 9-year or 11-year cycle overlaid the decennial cycle. And this is where the connection with sunspots, I think, is quite interesting, because that is the same variance depending on how much data you analyze. So he attempted to find the reason behind the decennial pattern, looked at sunspots and solar radiation, average rainfall, barometric pressure, and other weather causing conditions, believing that weather patterns were the most likely cause of change in human psychology. So important there in terms of the behavioral implications in society and markets, and how ultimately the natural phenomena influences us all. It was then well accepted that weather had an effect on health and disease. And if you go back to ancient Greece, this was first mentioned by Hippocrates in terms of optimism, pessimism, and the influence on health. Now, I'm a big fan of the work of William Stanley Jevons. I hope to see more awareness of this work across the board. I think he's an unsung British hero of psychoanalysis and particularly sunspot research. His son later on continued his work after his father passed, but actually more to also save face for the family, because Jevons received a lot of pushback from the scientific peer group at the time, because they just did not want to accept that there were any natural phenomena effects in markets, full stop. And so that became a cross that his son later on had to carry to prove his father's work, and then also to raise awareness as to how the work could make a difference. So in 1875, Jevons read a paper on the influence of sunspot period upon the price of corn at a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. This captured the attention of the media and led to the coining of the word sunspottery for claims of links between various cyclical events and sunspot. In later work, and this is actually something worth looking up, Commercial Crisis and Sunspots was published. Jevons analyzed business cycles, proposing that crises in economy might not be random events. And this would have been a real innovative idea at the time, because there was an opposing view in terms of the rhythmic drivers of event risk and just economic action in general. The idea of it having some kind of invisible force, mechanistic or natural, was just probably too much for the cultural boundaries of that time, and perhaps even to some degree these days. To clarify the concept, he presented a statistical study relating to business cycles with sunspots, and his reasoning was that sunspots affected weather, which in turn affected crops, especially in the early 1910s, 20s, 30s, and 40s, where the agricultural economy was strong, and so the weather and sun connection was more obvious. Subsequent studies have found that sunny weather has a small but significant effect, significant positive effect on stock returns, probably due to its impact on the mood of traders. And so mood and behavior is another buzzword that I want to invite you all to think about as we progress in this presentation. So there are just two pioneer highlights in terms of Edgar Lawrence Smith and his publication Tides and Affairs of Men in 1939, and then William Stanley Jevons, and also the work of his son that carried over that work in order for it to be proven true, and for it to help provide meaningful awareness for us all. Now, just to follow the case for natural cycles, this is the scientific feedback model developed by Dr. Campion, who is actually one of our guest speakers today, but we look forward to hearing his insights in future. Back in, I believe, the late 1980s, he developed this framework to explain how natural phenomena or planetary cycles created physical disturbances. So if you follow from top left all the way to the right, led to physical disturbance in solar system, which then created electromagnetic disturbance around Earth, physical changes on Earth, and then as you would have heard from many of our FSC science and nature experts, atmospheric and climatic changes, droughts, floods, volcanoes, all of these are examples of earthly impact from outer natural influences, which of course then lead to fluctuations in agricultural production and the impact on the economy, social change, and even politics. And that was a big feature of what we heard from both speakers on day one in terms of the geopolitical and even societal influence. Now, what I want to do is to highlight the yellow areas, because I think this is really important in terms of existing and ongoing research in this space. There is a more fast shortcut between natural cyclical influences and people via physical metabolism effects, which can also lead to change in collective behavior. And just to be very clear as to what that means, please look at the work called Heliobiology by Alexander Chizevsky. Both Ray Tomes and myself are big supporters of global pioneers in cycles, but also many of our counterparts in Russia. Remember, just name a few: Kondratiev, Chizevsky, and others that did great work in this space. Chizevsky actually created a whole line of research, specifically in heliobiology, but much more. He was very much a polymath, and what I don't think is well known. An industry colleague and peer of Edward Dewey. So in Dewey's own work, he actually writes about reviewing Chizevsky's work and potentially vice versa. And so there was a mutual respect and maybe crossover in understanding. And of course, you can find that maybe in Dewey's books, but also in the article that we republished on the website titled "The Case for the Case for Cycles," I should say. So Chizevsky proposed that not only did geomagnetic storms resulting from sunspot-related solar flares affect electrical usage, plane crashes, epidemics, grasshopper infestation, but human mental life and activity too. Increased negative ionization in the atmosphere, increased human mass excitability, and there's a human mass excitability chart, which is worth looking up. I hope we can get it on the FSC website soon, which shows the peaks and troughs in social mood and what he referred to as excitability, leading to all kinds of different social events. Chizevsky proposed that human history is influenced by an 11-year peak in sunspot activity, triggering humans en masse to act upon existing grievances and complaints through revolts, revolutions, civil wars, and wars between nations. Okay, so that builds us into the main topic, natural cycles as a potential overlay to the decennial pattern led by sunspot cycles. There is a vast amount of research as to the behavior of the sun, why it creates this cyclical pattern. Ray did a deep dive on the detail in terms of the scientific framework, but just suffice, I'm giving you here the visual pattern, which on average is 9 to 11 years if you are sampling 100 years of data. If you go back even further to 300 years, and I think the data goes back to the 1700s, you will identify a larger variance. So it really depends what historical data sample you're looking at in the first place. So most mainstream research only looks at 100 years, which means they often quote the 9 to 10 or 11 year range. And then it depends which paper you're reading as to which number they choose. I focus less on the magic number and more on the pattern and some of the cause effect that drives that. Here is the same pattern, but on my computer system overlaid with some analysis. And you can see that sunspots truly do impact social mood and actually can and have led to financial panics. So you can see all the way back to, on the left side of the chart, the Great Panic, 1907 and 1910, which led to the creation of the central bank in the United States, Federal Reserve, the Great Depression of the 1930s, the oil crisis, 73-74, the 87 crash, which was a baby crash, but still meaningful, Russian default of 1998, the global financial crisis of 2008, and then ahead of time in terms of the pandemic crash of 2020, which I later on reframed the global reset, was originally predicted by this data, and I had managed to present this at one of the conferences of the International Federation of Technical Analysis in Asia ahead of time as a high probability event. No certainties, only probabilities. And of course, the rest is history. We know that there was a pandemic crisis and a crash that followed. And Sunspot did give us that information Some people attribute that to the decennial pattern. Others include natural phenomena like sunspots. I prefer to just have an open and honest debate on this and include all factors as potential drivers. The other thing I should add is it's not just financial panics and ultimately the pessimism that leads to that negative social mood. But if you look to the upside, peaks in sunspot data actually do lead to euphoria. And remember the work of Krzyzewski, and I'll just go back one. He speaks about the human mass excitability. So he's looking at the positive effect of sunspot as well as negative grievances, complaints, the revolts, revolutions, civil wars, and wars between nations. So he's looking at both sides of the coin. And you can see here the plus side, euphoria, in one case example, did lead to the tech bubble boom of 2000, and there are other examples that we can highlight. Having said that, the bottoms in cycles and in natural cycles like sunspots are traditionally more reliable than the tops. That takes us back to cycle 101 in terms of how cycles function and why they are more reliable in that way. The other thing is it's not a correlation one for one. This is just showing that each financial shock coincided with a sunspot minima extreme. So it doesn't happen every time, but it has coincided more often than not. This is the updated data of the same pattern, just giving us the inflection point for 2022, where we are right now, and a peak thereafter, I believe in 2024 or thereabouts, and another low in 2031. I'd be interested to hear from Ray in terms of what he thinks about the sunspot data number 25. There's so much debate going on as to what it all means, and it'd be good to maybe discuss that at more length later. Now, all of this ties in as part of a timing confluence with this market cycle framework that I shared with you. This is a chart mosaic, which I spend quite a lot of time doing as part of my market work. And you can see here, if you just follow it sequentially from top left, figure 1, that's the roadmap market model with a asymmetric shape. So you can see a mountain climb up and a cliff drop down, 2/3 up, 1/3 down, with a fractal pattern that is embedded with that. Suggests that we're in a late cycle mode right now. And that's all based on the Schumpeter adapted cycle schema, specifically the jugular, which is a variation of the same theme in terms of the decennial cycle, the 10-year pattern, and possibly influenced by sunspots. If you run spectral statistical analysis on each of these cycles, the ones that feature as the most robust is jugular and Kuznets. That's the 9 to 10-year cycle and the 20-year cycle. And a composite measure of those two as a standalone shows a potential heightened risk for a market drop in the second half of this year going into 2023. So it does tie in with what we're seeing here on the sunspot data point, as it did in 2020 when the previous prediction was made by the data and myself in market work. And then just from a qualitative perspective, of course, there are always different market characteristics and behavior at each stage of a business cycle. This shows a mix of macro, economic, fundamental valuation, and technical indicators all blended together, also suggesting that we're currently late cycle going into recessionary territory right here now, based on falling post-peak in growth, greed assets unwinding from extreme levels, and technicals looking quite vulnerable on a global cross-asset basis. It suggests that cash is king. Long duration government bonds will remain important, depending on the quality ones that we're able to hide in. And from a equity sector perspective, large cap growth in terms of safety remains important, and defensive sectors will also be key too. In terms of currency, Swiss franc, and maybe the dollar, and of course gold, which doesn't look too good right now, but maybe on a relative basis will still preserve your capital. And then just final points on additional correlations, not to markets, but to sunspot. So if we are open to the idea of the natural phenomena of what we do see on a day-to-day basis, the start of the day, the sun, and the end of the day, the moon, then what about other planets which create a gravitational force in the solar system, and how that would impact the sun? So to keep it simple, the examples I'm giving here from a scientific research magazine is focusing on the sun's displacement due to gravitational pull. I don't believe there's a reference in terms of why, but Ray Terms did mention probable causation for that. I think Ray, you mentioned a few factors there that I'll let you recite if you wish. But this just shows the effect of the sun as part of a climactic dance. And as it experiences extreme displacement in this one snapshot between 1922 and 1939, that also chimes in with Great War years. And so this brings it back to this idea of societal tension, geopolitical risk to the extent of the Great War years, and how that mapped out coincided with sunspot, sorry, not sunspot, the sun's movement as influenced by gravitational pull. And so when looking at that research, I asked myself the question, well, what are the bigger giants in the solar system, and how do they correlate back with the sun? You can see here on a charting software that I use, the Jupiter declinations at the bottom, lining up more often than not, but not each time, with sunspot peaks and troughs. It's not exact, so you do need to add a level of error for this. And of course, remember, it's not just one planet that has an influence. There are many more, and perhaps other things that just remain a mystery of cycles. But at the very least, it's something worth researching based on this chart, but also including a lot of research that is out there that highlights a similar connection. You may have heard of Ray mentioning the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions, which is often referred to as a great chronocator cycle or a master cycle. It was originally discovered by the great ancient Persian Empire, and it was their way of highlighting the rise and fall of civilizations and important events in time. It happens to chime in with long-term cyclical start and end points on the stock market. And I think it averages about 20 years. And you can see there on the Dow Jones index going back 100 years, that it is a useful yardstick. The blue vertical bar highlights whenever there's a conjunction between the two big planets in the solar system, Jupiter and Saturn. Remember the gravitational pull that will create, and of course, the effect it will have not just on the sun, but on us in terms of social mood, and how social mood inevitably, as part of the behavioral component of markets, will drive the ebb and flow up and down. And so you can see here the effect and the prediction for 2020 that did play out. But more specifically, my final chart, the composite cycle, is the second one that a friend and myself have been developing, which looks not at economic cycles, but natural cycles in one mix. And you can see here that backdating, it was significant tension points in terms of World War I and II, the Second Cold War in '83, where most geopolitical experts predicted that as the end of the world, but actually it led to a big recovery thereafter. based on this data. And what's interesting is if you then look at this chart at this trough here, I didn't actually add the label, this peak at the top and then secondary intermediate trough here was the global financial crisis of 2008. Now, what's very interesting about this is back then, we did think that was the end of our economy and we were going to go into a Great Depression. But according to this chart, it wasn't meant to be. Fate or free will, I'll leave you all to think about that. But certainly, the cycle suggested that things were bad, but not as bad as we thought they were. We were going to recover. And actually, the worst was yet to come, but not then, more specifically 2018 onwards, according to 2 different data series. Remember, 2018 was the start of what people call Volmageddon, when there was a big volatility event, which then ultimately led to the pandemic crash of 2020. And more specifically, if you look at the blue line composite, that is the better data point, and that shows that we had further extreme tension from 2020 all the way into 2023. And remember, if I go back a few points, 2023 is highlighted on sunspots and on the economic composite cycle based on what I had shared with you before. So I shall stop there on a final wrap. The key points, Dewey, the foundation of the study of cycles, how modern cycle prediction was reborn out of the 1930s Great Depression. It is my hope and true belief that the same thing may happen again if we get further disruption. I'm going to ask that open question to our chairman, Dr. Richard Smith, in terms of what he thinks about crisis opportunities ahead and what it means for cycle practitioners. It's the signature cycle framework used by my mentor, Robin Griffith, who's a market technician by profession and a cycle enthusiast. We focused on the decennial cycle, how that started the wave of interest in natural cycles, specific sunspots, and how mental maps such as the scientific feedback model really do help have more of an open mind and framework to this type of analysis. And then lastly, we just ended on further planetary correlations to the sun and the composite cycle that I just ended with. My final takeaway is the map is not the territory, and this has been something that I've learned through my own hard experience, and many mentors and industry colleagues have repeated it back to me. I find that often the challenge in cycle analysis is not believing that you have found the key to unlock the door, because the moment that you think you have, the cycle will change the combination. And I believe this is probably how it is. It's the nature of cycles, it's the mystery of cycles, and as some experts say, it's the enigma of cycles too. So on that, I will leave you with the cartoon of the blind and the elephant. If you think you found the snake, the rope, or the wall, have another thing. Thank you very much, Ron William, Natural Cycles and Markets. Really appreciate your engagement and happy to take any questions.
Hi, Ron.
Hey, Richard. I have an intro for our fireside chat, but before I do, just going to check to see if there's any questions.
Great presentation. Well done.
Thank you. Enthusiastic, but still looking for more answers to questions.
A lot of information in a short period of time, too.
Yes, indeed. I see David's asking a question. Is it possible that sunspot markets are parallel effects that not direct causes, and there is a more fundamental cause of each? Tidal gravitational dynamics. I'll leave that question for Ray. And then if there are any questions, I can follow up later on. So if I can give you a formal intro to our discussion, just a moment. I have a slide ready to mark the
update that picture.
Discussion. Great picture, anti. So to all our members, new, existing and new, as an intro to the fireside chat with our chairman of the Foundational Study of Cycles, Dr. Richard Smith. Dr. Richard Smith studied mathematics at the University of California, Berkeley, and then earned his PhD in system science from Watson School of Engineering at sunny Binghamton, under the late Professor George Krill, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. Over the last decade, he has researched, thank you, he has researched and developed algorithms and services that provide investors with tools to develop a systematic approach to investing. Smith has led and exited multiple successful businesses based on his work, and his platforms have been used and trusted by tens of thousands of individual investors managing and tracking billions of dollars. He has also been involved more specifically with the foundation for over a decade, and was responsible for the ground up rebuilding of the tech signal software nearly a decade ago. Welcome, Richard. You've been here throughout the event, of course, day one and day two. Maybe if we can begin with your insights as to the various themes led by great speakers through those 2 days, what your thinking is and how that might impact the study of cycles.
Well, I'd just first like to say thank you to all the speakers, and thank you to everyone who's helped really get the foundation back and off the ground. So it's been very gratifying to see the quality of speakers and to be able to bring this information to the public and to our growing audience. So very exciting to see this much interest in non-market related aspects of cycles. So that's really exciting. And just in general to see the interest in Cycles TV and in our growing membership. This is why I helped bring the foundation back to life. And I think we're making great strides and very proud of the work that everybody's doing. So, and with that, in terms of my personal takeaways from all the talks, it's been fascinating to see the consistency of the theme of crisis in cycles right now. And as much as I tend to try to, be a bit skeptical and not jump to conclusions. But I have to say, when looking around, that those predictions have certainly had the ring of truth. I'm not the oldest guy on the planet, but I'm old enough to have been through a few cycles, and it is a very intense time that we're living through right now. And it does feel like there are major cultural and cyclical shifts taking place and economic shifts taking place. And my biggest takeaway is that it's a time to be very self-aware. And I think it was David Murren who made the point that really, we do have some influence over the directions that these cycles take us, right? So being more self-aware, understanding that cycles are at work, and that what cycles lead to is really involved with how we react and how we respond to cycles. So I think it's a time when we have to all be very measured. I think it's a time when we have to all be, to kind of tamp down the emotional reactions to the crises and be more attentive to how we can respond. There's a big difference between reacting and responding. And it really is a time where responding, being responsible, being able to respond is more critical than it's ever been in my lifetime. It feels perilous.
And I know, Richard, you and I have discussed this idea of uncertainty, which seems to be like an ongoing buzzword that so many people keep going again and again. We had a brief chat about this a while back. What's your perspective on the uncertainty of these heightened times? What the cycles are predicting, basically. I mean, we heard from David Katzmeier, so crisis in the US for 2027. David Murren was talking about us being in the eye of the storm right now. Also, our board colleague, Andy Pancioli, had some great calls early this year, which many of which have come true. All disruption, uncertainty. In your experience and studies of uncertainty, what can we learn?
We are uncomfortable with uncertainty by nature. I'm not sure exactly why, but that's been something that's fascinated me, my whole adult life. And really, how do we learn to embrace uncertainty and work with uncertainty and make it an ally, instead of a foe, and not try to put our heads in the sand, so to speak, and pretend it doesn't exist, but to really, take in as much of it as we can. And that's hard to do. And it does take kind of act of the will, if you will, to really allow it in, try not to jump to conclusions, absorb the information, and again, increase our ability to be responsive instead of reactive.
And building on that point, if in terms of the focus of the foundation, it's really a wide spectrum of cycle research in so many different things. And early in Jan, we were focusing on markets, and of course in late June, we'll be revisiting markets again. Right here and now, as we focus on cycles and science and nature, how important is that in your mind, Richard, to the foundation and just to the study of cycles?
Well, I think it's very important. I think it needs to become even more important. It's, markets are wonderful. They are a collection of all our actions, and but they're not the whole story. And so getting to a deeper understanding of cycles in general. I loved your connections between solar cycles and markets as just one illustrative example. I think that's key. A lot of my work, and interest in science has been with kind of a nagging discomfort with, I guess, the metaphysics of science, if you will. And so I think that there's something in cycles that's, I guess, at the heart of it could bring us to a little more humble relationship with the world, instead of trying to always control everything and be in control and imagine that we're in control when we're not. I know one of the themes that came up in Ray's talk, hi Ray, welcome, was about, why don't people accept this obvious, correlation that Ray has shown us. And it's, a big part of it is that for whatever reason, you can, speculate about the origins of it, but we all like to feel that we're in control, right? And Dewey said this himself in his book, Cycles and Mysterious Forces That Trigger Events, right? It's very uncomfortable to feel like we're not in control. But again, this is part of, being more cooperative with uncertainty rather than just trying to, beat it into submission.
Yeah, I think that's all good advice, Richard. And I'm thinking back to how the foundation got started. Dewey had been working in the economics area, mainly business, and he heard about that there'd been this conference, and what was the name of the place?
Metamac.
Yeah, that's the one. And a bunch of scientists had got together and discussed these strange things like the Canadian lynx population going up and down dramatically, and another number of other ones. And there were a number of periods they'd found that different groups of animals went on and other related things. And as soon as he read about that, he got in touch with a guy that organised, I think it was Copley, and and within weeks they'd formed the foundation. They'd got together all this group of scientists and all this group of business people, and they made the foundation in 1941, and it really took off. And I do believe strongly that you need both of those components to have the Cycles Foundation work well. I think the Cycles Foundation got into a sad state in the 1990s when the science side got neglected in favour of the business side, and the foundation died. And I think we're doing the right thing now and trying to keep both of these things going, to get things going well. And it is important to have a wide view of the world. And it is important, as you say, Richard, to realise these things are happening. We're not in control. The first time I ever talked about cycles was in the 70s when I went to a Statistical Association conference in Wellington. And I put up some graphs of these things I'd found using factor analysis on a lot of economic data. And a couple of economists got up and said, no. They said, oh, that cycle you found there, that's a Kondratiev cycle, and that one's a Schumpeter cycle, and that's a Jevon cycle, and that's a something or other. And they said they don't exist. The only one is the business cycle. And I thought, that's funny. Why do they give names to things that don't exist? And one after the other, people from other areas popped up and said, no, that one's a graph of what we see in social services. And this is the graph of what we see in some other area and some other area. So I realized that that these things were going on and they were real. But I also realized that the economists didn't like to admit they were real. And I hadn't thought about it. And I thought, oh, it's because the economists are employed by the government to tell them, if you do this, this will happen. You've got control. We know that they haven't. It never happens how they said. But it's like when Dewey asked people about the 1929 share crash. He was given that job. And he said he interviewed 100 economists and he asked them what they thought. And he said he got 100 different answers of why there was the great crash. And he says, there's only one of them I think is right. That was the one that said, Edward, we really don't know. Yeah.
And I think that was, or that it cycles, right?
Yeah,
we really don't know. And there appear to be cycles.
Yeah, he put together the different cycles to, someone said to him, don't try to work out why it happens, work out what happens. And so he got the cycles, and when he got the cycles through into the 20s and ran them forward, they predicted the crash. And funnily enough, I only found out about this in the 80s, and I'd been doing the same thing, and I had got the data on the share markets, and in 86, when I ran them forwards, it predicted a crash in 1987. And so I told this to my business partners, and they had told it to some of the companies we did work for, and they all said, oh, Ray's gone mad. But of course, we had it. I was a month out. I said it was going to be September. It was October. It's always October. So that's the, it happens and it works. And at that stage, I got Dewey's stuff from the 1960s, his stock market cycles, and I ran them forwards, and they predicted the 1987 share crash as well, 20 years before.
Yeah. Well, when I look around the world, Ray, I see a tremendous business in, let's just call it a pretend authority, right?
Yeah.
There's just a huge market for people appearing to be confident and, saying that they've got answers, right? Yeah. and the vast majority of them turn out to be wrong, and yet the world keeps turning and people want more false certainty every day, right? So yeah. I think there we are, I do think there's a little bit of reality check that is taking hold of people across the globe today, realizing that we don't have all the answers, and that all of these attempts to pretend that we have the answers are not productive anymore. Yeah. And I think that the foundation has a role to play in that conversation, and in terms of bringing an awareness to cycles and letting everybody know that we're not in control, and that's okay. Yeah. So I agree with you completely. And Ray, we're very grateful for your involvement with the foundation and your work. I think you do outstanding work. But we do need even more engagement and participation on the scientific side. And I think that we will make more contact with scientists working in cycles in the coming years. And I'm really looking forward to it.
Yes, that's very important. In the early days of the foundation, there were a lot, as well as a lot of businessmen, there were a lot of scientists from universities and in other places involved in the foundation. and we need to get that back again. So we've got to.
And I think we also need to really
them.
help, not restore, but help the world understand Dewey's contributions. He was
absolutely
an incredible leader in the 20th century. I think in many ways, he was one of the original behavioral economists, even before a lot of the Nobel Prize winning work was done. So I think he deserves a wider audience, and certainly a foundation that lives up to his standards. And while I think we have plenty of room to grow, I think we've done a decent job of not sullying the history of the foundation.
Yeah, the case for cycles should be compulsory reading for everyone who wants to study anything.
Absolutely.
Well, two points on that. So the case for cycles is now, as I understand, part of another affiliate professional group. So IFTA, that's now part of the educational syllabus, which is great, and we hope to share more with other groups. But I was going to bring it back to the foundation, Richard, in terms of the Dewey book that is planned to be republished over the long term. Any insights that we can share with our members?
Well, we do have a tentative agreement to have Dewey's most important book, Cycles, The Mysterious Forces That Trigger Events, to be republished by Harriman House as part of their Classics series. They're excited about republishing this book. It does take a while, and we do have some work to do to get it into shape so it'll be ready for publication, and even to add a couple of contemporary commentaries on some of Dewey's original studies. So very excited about that, and I think that'll be a big contribution to making Dewey more of a household name than he is today.
And just as a final note, Richard, the market forecast event soon to follow this event, late June. Any word that you'd like to share?
Well, I think we had a fantastic event in January. I think we have, quite a rare collection of authentic market cycles. Analysts with Jake Bernstein and Bill Cerubi, Andy Pancioli, and of course, Lars Bontinen is doing incredible work with the algorithms that were developed at the foundation that have now been embodied in software and applied to data that Dewey could have only dreamed of back in his day. And I think Peter Eliades is going to be joining us also. So it doesn't get any better than this, folks, and looking forward to bringing you this valuable content.
A great completion to our event with, wonderful speaker lineup, timely themes, and a record attendance from existing members and new. Look forward to future events to follow. The market forecast event in late June, and another science summit too. And just as a quick reminder, Ray will also be doing further awareness work in terms of cycles in science and nature. Watch out our YouTube channel for more content to follow along with our Cycles magazine, which is coming out in June, that also has some great contribution in there.
Looking forward to your harmonics work, Ray.
Yeah, we'll get there eventually.
I think it's very important.
Yes, thanks.
All right, well, thank you all. It's been great. Thanks everybody for attending. And Ron, thanks for your leadership here. Outstanding job. And we'll see y'all again soon.